Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hello and welcome. Welcome to the first ever episode of The Examined Life with Phil Kallberg. That's me here. This is a show where I apply the methods, logic, and rationality of rigorous philosophy to the problems and issues of society, life, the universe, and everything. So thanks for tuning in to what I hope will be the first of many episodes of this show. Since this is the first episode we're ever doing, I'm going to spend some time laying out just what this show will be about and why I'm doing it. Now, for why I'm doing it, there's really a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is that Dr. Sebastian Mahfood asked me if I'd want to do a show here on WCAT after Pat Flynn interviewed me about an essay I presented up at the 2018 meeting of the Minnesota Philosophical Society. And you can find that interview in the queue of the list of shows we have here. And a side note, that meeting up in Minnesota really was great, and if I can make it to the one next year as well, I will. The long answer is, well, quite a bit much longer, as the name suggests there. So, I've always had an interest in philosophy and intellectual things. I can recall several times when I was a kid where my parents would get frustrated with me because I was ignoring the world around me while I was reading a book. I can remember one time in particular where my mom came back at some point during the day and asked me if my dad had been there that day or not. And, well, my dad and I had actually had a whole conversation, but because I was trying to read a book at the same time I was talking to him, I couldn't remember that I'd had that conversation with Dad, and naturally both my parents were rather frustrated about that. And I can even recall my mom talking about, kind of lamenting a little bit, how my cousin Luke and I would sit down and talk about the problems of the world when we were like 8 and 9 years old, instead of running off and doing more normal kids things. But this interest I have in philosophy really came to a head during my time in the military, as I was forced to deal with some existential questions, and these are things like, well, does God actually exist or not? And if he does he really care about us or not? And so that's the longer story here. I joined the military straight out of high school way back in 2000, and I was working, after we got done with the training, I was working in military communications and living in Germany. I like to tell people that if you had picked up a phone and a military communication system and dialed 0, you'd have got me or somebody who did the job I did, and we'd both have told you that you dialed the wrong number. So all that was going pretty well for me until 9/11, and then everything just kind of went to crap. I was really enjoying my time in the military before that. It was fun living in Germany. I had made some good friends, seen a lot of good things. There's a lot of good culture to explore in Germany. But after 9/11, that all kind of went away due to some other things. And now, I don't want to come across as, being childish, selfish, and arrogant, because a lot of people died from 9/11, both directly in that day and as a result of the things that happened afterwards, and a lot of people suffered a lot more horribly than I did. And so while I'm talking about how it affected me here, I'm, quite aware of the fact that a lot of other people suffered in much worse ways than I did, and I don't want to minimize that at all. So what happened at the base I was at in Germany, as a result of 9/11, myself and pretty much every other soldier who was of lower rank in my unit had to start guarding the base. And the reason for this is that typically it's the job of the military police to guard bases, but there simply weren't enough of them. The bases in Germany had been there since World War II. It's, a peaceable place. They weren't very well secured. There were just some fences around and many entrances and exits because people were just used to coming and going. So that made it very difficult to actually secure those bases, and you needed a lot of people to do that. Now, we weren't actually trained in how to do this. My training was on how to make the phones work, how to make sure the communications links are up, how to troubleshoot that, and many things along those lines. So as a result of us not being trained for it, we kind of had to learn on the fly, and there was a lot of hiccups and a lot of problems. In the years since, I've talked to some other people who were trying to come and go on bases during that time, and they were talking about how there were so many delays, and the delays were because the majority of the soldiers doing the guarding then on 9/11 and for the days, weeks, and months, and even years afterwards, just did not know what they were doing because we had never been trained on how to do that. Military police are, but we weren't. Now, because there was so much area to secure and they needed so many people, we then had to work 8 to 12-hour guard shifts, and often this would be, we're wearing what they called full battle rattle. You've got a Kevlar flak vest, a full weapon, and ammo. I had a saw at that particular time, which probably weighs, I don't remember exactly, but might weigh upwards of 10 or 15 pounds. And so it would be very common that we'd be out there 8 to 12 hours a day wearing 50 pounds or more of equipment. And we would have to do this 8 to 12 hours a day, often going for weeks without a break. Now, remember, this is in the middle of Germany, in an urban city in Germany. We're not in the middle of a war zone. We're not in Iraq or Afghanistan while this is going on. And what this did is it started to show the cracks in how my unit was run, as the upper leadership would pretty regularly still work 40-hour weeks and take the weekends off, while the rest of us were going upwards of sometimes 80 hours a week or more. And we would have to do this for weeks at a time without any time off to recuperate. I remember an email I sent to some people after I finally got a chance to take a break after a couple weeks of this, and all I really said in it is my feet hurt because I'd been standing on them for 8 to 12 hours a day for weeks on end, and if you're not used to that, it makes your feet hurt quite a bit. Now, this carried on for probably the next year and a half or two while we were in garrison in Germany. We weren't doing the jobs we were trained for. All we were really doing is these 8 to 12-hour shifts of guard or duty, and often without days off or breaks. And again, this is going on well. The higher officers and higher NCOs in my unit are taking breaks and are only working roughly 8-hour days, with a few exceptions here or there. Now, I'll also add that for the first couple of months after 9/11 happened, nobody really complained about any of these things, because we all saw that something, horrifically serious had happened, and we all needed to support each other and do what we could to pull through. It was only after months and months and months had gone by, and there didn't seem to be as much need for us to be doing what we were doing, that we started to get some hint that something was wrong here. And the problem essentially was that the leadership of the unit I was in there didn't really care about us at all. It didn't care about the lower level soldiers like me. We would often have to report in at 3:30 a.m. in the morning for a guard shift that would start hours later. And the reason we had to do that, an hour and a half or 2 hours in advance, is because the 3 levels of leadership, that is the company, the battalion, and the brigade, all demanded that they give us their own specific briefings. And we also had to form up in a formation and march to those particular buildings where that leadership was headquartered, so they'd give us the briefings on site. Not on site. They'd give us the briefings there at that headquarters. It wasn't like they came to us. So you'd get up before 3:30 in the morning. Sometimes I would try and roll out of bed at 3:20 and make it down just because that's so early. Go down to the bottom of the basement of our company where our weapons were, sign them out, then wait around for a briefing from our company, then march over to the battalion and wait around for a briefing from them, then march over to the brigade and wait around for a briefing from them, and then finally, probably about 5:30 or 6, make it out to where we were supposed to do our guard duty. So naturally this was pretty frustrating, as you can see that there's a lot of redundancy and unnecessary things going on there with how the leadership is not coordinating with each other. Additionally, after about 6 months or so after 9/11, a lot of my friends who were in other units in the Army told me that their lives were more or less going, back to normal. They'd been going through similar heightened guard duty and what the military calls force protection immediately after 9/11, but in the months afterwards, their units seemed to more or less get a handle on things and find ways to adapt and restore some sense of normality to their soldiers' lives. Now, there's an important distinction here that you're probably not going to see or understand if you've never been in the military, but that's that the military is typically supposed to function differently when it's in garrison as opposed to when it's actually off in war. Now, if you're actually in war in a combat zone where people are shooting at you, you might be shooting back, pretty much all bets are off. But as a way of trying to keep soldiers from getting overwhelmed with stress and enable them to live good lives and have high morale, when you're in garrison, which is what we were in Germany, you're at a base, your family's there with you, things along those lines. In garrison, they try to give you somewhat of a normal life, a reasonably normal work day. You might pull some shifts, but it would be like 8 hours for 5 days. You'd have 2 days off, maybe not the weekend. Sometimes you can't get everything you want, and people have to be around all the time manning things, but they try to give you some sense of normality. They typically wouldn't want to be changing your schedule last minute on the fly, saying you're going to have a day off and then turn around and canceling it, things along those lines. Again, there's exceptions, things happen in life, but that's how they try to do it at least. And it's not that way in a war zone, but that's understandable that it's not that way in a war zone. Things are different when you're at war than when you're living a normal life. So anyhow, what my friends who were in other units told me is that after about 6 months or so, give or take a little bit, their lives were more or less returning to that normal way of doing things in garrison. Now, at the same time, it's not like everything was completely normal. The military was on war footing because the U.S. had invaded Afghanistan at this point, and some units were preparing to go down to Afghanistan. They were training and things like that. But it was still a lot more normal and predictable than what my unit was doing. Now, things did get a little better in my unit as time went on. After 6 months to a year or so, we started getting some time off a little bit more regularly, and eventually we only had to go to one briefing before each guard shift, but it was still nothing comparable at all to what my friends in other units were. Now, I'm sure you're probably thinking, what does all this have to do with philosophy? And, just bear with me a little bit. I'll give you some more details, and then you'll see the point I'm trying to make here by my story here. Now, we were a communications unit, and a key thing for a communications unit is that everyone who's working in it has to have a security clearance, and this should be pretty obvious why that is. If you're setting up a phone network so the general can communicate with his guys on the front line, that needs to be secure for obvious reasons, and so you need to have a security clearance so the military knows they can trust you to do that kind of thing. Now, at the same time, it was also supposed to be the case that the Army had a zero-tolerance policy on drug use, meaning if you got caught taking illicit drugs, they kicked you out, period. However, that's not what actually happened. Once we started getting days off some of the guard shifts, some people in the unit started going to Amsterdam and getting high. And naturally, they got caught because the Army runs drug tests on their people. Now, because the Army was in war footing and they wanted more bodies, they didn't kick any of them out. Rather, these people who got caught using drugs lost their security clearances and then were moved to the administration company that handles all the paperwork, because there's a massive amount of paperwork in the military. Way too much, in fact. Now, typically, this paperwork company would only work 5 8-hour days. So, in effect, what this meant is that the Army was rewarding the people who broke the rules by making their lives easier, and it was also, in de facto, punishing those of us who did not break the rules, as every time someone got moved to the paper company, the rest of us would have to pick up the slack and do even more. Now, obviously, this is unfair and at least a little unjust. What was going on here is that the system and institution I'd volunteered my time, and potentially even my life to, was starting to betray me and the other people around me. We were all getting pretty frustrated, but a good many of us tried to act at least somewhat honorably and figure, well, I committed my time to the Army for this long. I'm going to stick it through, even though I don't like the way it's going, and they're never going to get me to re-enlist after they've been treating us this way. Just as an example of this, I recall that many soldiers in my unit had marital problems and family problems with this. Some of them even got divorced, and the primary reason was that their wives and families didn't want to put up with their husbands always being gone and never being at home while we were in garrison, and that many of us were so constantly stressed, and I'm sure many of them brought that stress home and gave it to their wives and families, because that's what most people do. I wasn't married at the time, so I didn't do that, but I do recall thinking that I was pretty glad I wasn't married at the time, because I couldn't see how any woman would put up with all that going on, with me constantly being gone and being stressed out of my mind and so frustrated all the time. I can also recall a conversation I had about 2 years into all this mess with a higher level sergeant. Now, he'd been in the Army for 15 years or so. I think it might have even been a little more, and he was making a career out of it. Anyhow, when I told him that this particular unit here in Germany was the only one I'd ever been in, it was my first duty station, he kind of expressed shock and said, wow, if this had been my first duty station, if this had been my only unit, I never would have stayed in the military. I wouldn't have made it a career. Because he honestly saw all the problems that was going on, that the leadership didn't care about their soldiers, that they weren't taking care of us, and he didn't want anything to do with that. And he was looking forward to the time when he'd get transferred off somewhere else. The bottom line here is that my unit was ran very, very poorly by leadership that did not look out for the soldiers under their command, and this leadership cared quite a bit more about adding some more lines and bullet points to their resumes than they did about the lives of their soldiers and families. And then after about 3 years of this, the problem got even worse. At this point, they moved me and people like me, the ones who were trying to be somewhat honorable even though we were so frustrated and just wanted to be done with all this mess. They moved us to another unit so they could deploy us to Iraq. This was about 2004, the end of 2003 when this happened. Now, of course, going off to war is always a possibility when you're in the military. I was only in my late teens and early 20s when all this happened, but I was not a great fool and recognized this. I can recall having some conversations with people who were in the military who would say, I just can't see that I would ever bring myself to kill someone. And can be an ethical and philosophically sound position that I can respect. But you're a fool if you don't think about that before you join the military. And I had thought about that. I recognized this was a possibility. Going off to war wasn't exactly the thing that made this so bad, although nobody should ever be really happy about doing that. The trouble was that I was scheduled to get out of the military in July of 2004, as I had only enlisted for 4 years, and after all the garbage they'd thrown on me for the last several years, there was no way I was going to stay in longer. Now, the military has a procedure that they call stop-loss, and the idea behind this is you sign up for the military, you're in for 4, 6, maybe 8 years. Well, suppose at 7.5 years of your enlistment, China decides they're going to start World War III with the U.S. Well, they're going to need people to go fight the war, so they're going to do what they call a stop-loss and refuse to allow you to leave the military, because they can't have people exiting in the middle of a big emergency like that. And, there's a good reason for that. That makes a lot of sense. So, the unit I was in at the time was actually not scheduled to go to Iraq, but another unit that was stationed in garrison, they were only like 2 miles from us, they were. And that unit decided they want more people. So what the higher-ups did, probably some people who move papers around in the Pentagon somewhere, they went through the unit I was in, pulled out everybody who wasn't a problem person, and sent them over to this other unit so they could stop-loss us and send us down to Iraq. So naturally I was pretty frustrated and unhappy about this, and a lot of people were. In fact, some of them even went and complained to the chaplain so they didn't have to go. I mean, after all, I'd been having a terrible time of it while I was in the military, and yet I'd still been making a good effort, at least, to honor the commitment I made. My philosophy was, I'm going to wait this out. I don't like being here, but I made a commitment to them, and I'm going to honor that even if they're not treating me well. It would have been very, very easy for me at that time to do something dishonorable, like run off to Amsterdam, take some drugs, and try to get myself kicked out. But I didn't do that. And because I did my job and tried to behave honorably, they decided they needed to force me to stay longer. In effect, what happened is I was being punished not because of some random event or just some unfortunate thing, but I was being punished for directly doing the right thing. And of course, the people who were problem people, who caused issues, who were taking drugs and stuff, none of them got transferred over to get stop-lossed. All of them managed to get out of the Army on time. And so now the real kicker is, when we finally got down into the combat zone in Kuwait and Iraq, about, I want to say, 70 to 80% of my unit that I was with, this new unit that they transferred me to, didn't even do anything. Most of them just sat around for an entire year and waited and did nothing. We were literally there as a backup to the redundancy. Which then leads you to think, why was it even necessary to stop-loss all these people, to force us in, to stay in longer, to do all this? Now, the squad that I was with, we actually did get to go do a few things for a few months here or there. We did manage to go up to Baghdad and one of the main bases up there and set up some comms and stuff, but even there, our communications links were a huge redundancy to the point that when one of our links went down, nobody even cared. The only people who cared were us. Nobody noticed if the phones we were providing service for weren't working because they had other ones they could use. Now, I wouldn't have used this term at the time that this was going on, but what all these events did is they forced me into an existential crisis. The worldview of my 21, 22-year-old self simply could not handle the fact that trying to do the right and honorable thing had directly caused suffering in my life. And now you can see how my story here ties into philosophy. The 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, he talked about existential crises in his book The Sickness Under Death. And Kierkegaard often uses some pretty verbose and difficult language. I mean, you can read him, but he's pretty difficult. I've heard somebody joke that the only two people who understand Kierkegaard are God and Kierkegaard. But nonetheless, we can say about his book there that what he says is that angst and existential crises like this arise when a person's worldview is unable to grasp, make sense of, and deal with their own life experiences, and that this usually happens because they're living on a worldview that's not their own, it's not authentic. Rather, they've borrowed it from their culture, parents, society, and so on. So, if you've ever been confronted by a problem that you don't know how to deal with, and it's making you question some very basic things about your life and the people around you, that's an existential crisis. For example, some people, like two parents lose a child who's like only 2 years old, that might put them into an existential crisis because that's a horrible thing. It's something that should not happen, and they might turn around and then start questioning, why did we have kids in the first place? How could God allow such a thing to happen? And so on and so forth. And that can cause an existential crisis. That's what I'm talking about here. Now, the other term I used, worldview, that's also a term you might not have heard of before if you don't study philosophy and things like that. It's really a very simple term. It just means how you view the world. It's a collection of all your ideas and beliefs and how you think life should go. So most people's worldviews involve things like murder's wrong and love is good. And there's Christian-specific worldviews, there's atheist-specific worldviews, Islamic-specific worldviews, and so on and so forth. And so what Kierkegaard is saying here is, when you confront something in your life that your worldview does not know how to handle, that can force you into an existential crisis. And it's even more likely if you're living with a worldview that you haven't thought about, that you haven't examined, that you haven't came to on your own, if it's one that you simply inherited from your parents, your society, or your culture. And this is exactly what happened to me here. Now, I'd grown up as a Christian and a pastor's kid, and we've all heard some stories of pastors' kids, but in my case, that was actually a very good thing. So what happened to me is, in the crisis here, I started questioning things like if God actually did care about me or not. I never really doubted God's existence, but I kind of had the idea of, if God cares about me, how can he allow it to happen that I'm suffering for doing the right thing? I expect to suffer for doing the wrong thing. That's the way it should be. But to be forced to suffer for doing the right thing, there's something horribly wrong about that. In fact, I might get this reference a little wrong, but I think Nietzsche said something along the lines of, if you really, really want to punish and hurt someone, don't punish them for doing the wrong thing. Punish them for doing the right thing, because that's going to drive them insane. They won't even understand how to deal with that. And I think he's right. That's a really horrific thing you could do to somebody. And part of the problem I was dealing with it is that that's what seemed to be happening to me. I was being punished and being made to suffer for doing the right thing. And a large part of this problem was that although I was a Christian, I was a follower of Christ then, the Christian worldview I was working from was not really my own. It was incomplete and flawed, and it was something that I had inherited from my parents and the society and culture I'd grown up in. I hadn't made it authentic. I hadn't made it my own. Now, I think from my own observations that it's at points like this that a lot of people who've grown up in it as Christians cease following Christ. Because what happens is that they have a worldview that they haven't made their own. They have this idea of what Christianity should be. And when it turns out that that's incomplete and inauthentic in some way, when the real world butts against it, they just abandon it because it doesn't work. They solve their existential crisis by saying, well, it must not be true. I'm going to walk away. So, this is the point where philosophy started to help me. I did a lot of reading while I was in Iraq because I still loved books. And I read one particular book that had this idea in it. It was a story, a fictional story, obviously, about how God had created the world. And it was told from the perspective of somebody who claimed to be the devil. It was called Memnoch the Devil. It's by Anne Rice. And I wouldn't recommend reading it for any theological or truths. It's definitely a heretical story. But the idea, one of the key ideas in the story was that God had made the world so that he could learn and grow. Now, obviously that's not the Christian God. The Christian God doesn't learn and grow. He's necessary, he's omniscient, and so on and so forth. But reading the story, the point that it came to me is, well, why couldn't it be the case that I'm going through this suffering, I'm being punished for doing the right thing, because I need to learn and grow? Because what if the point of being unjustly treated by the army is that I need an authentic worldview instead of one that's borrowed like the one that Kierkegaard criticized. You know, Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living, and that's where we got the name of this show from. The point here I'm making is that prior to this existential crisis, I was living with a borrowed worldview and an unexamined life. And this existential crisis that the army forced me into forced me to examine my worldview, forced me to think about all these big, hard questions like, does God actually care about me or not? And now I'm a much, much better person for it. And almost as soon as I had this realization that suffering could improve me in this way, it made me a better person and enabled me to deal with all this. And almost as soon as I had the realization that it was this unjust suffering that was going to enable me to grow and be a better person, that kind of pulled me through the existential crisis. And I realized, no, it's not that you're suffering because God doesn't care about you. Rather, I'm suffering because God cared about me, because he looked at Phil and said, we need to make Phil a more mature, healthy, responsible adult. We need to give him an authentic worldview. And the way to do that is to put him through the fire and refine him. And so that's what happened to me. Even though it was unpleasant and I wouldn't want to go through it again, I wouldn't be good, well, I wouldn't call myself good, but I wouldn't be as good as I am now if that hadn't happened. Now, in addition to my own experience here that I'm relating, there's just a wealth of research in many disciplines that demonstrate that when people are protected from suffering, it weakens them, and they become immature, selfish, and awful people. Conversely, when people are exposed to adversity, and it doesn't overwhelm them to the point of death, it isn't the sickness unto death like Kierkegaard describes, then they're made better for it. It makes them stronger. It's a bit like that much overused saying of Nietzsche's that which doesn't kill us makes us stronger. So, you're raising children, some of you are, I am, and you want your children to grow up to be good, strong, confident, healthy adults. Well, the way you do that is not by protecting them from everything all the time, although you have to do that to a degree when they're babies. But as they get older, you protect them from things less and less, so they bump into more things in the world that are unpleasant, that can hurt them, but never let those unpleasant things that can hurt them overwhelm them and kill them. Because if they bump into it as they get older, they'll get more mature, become better adapted, and then when they get to college, they won't be people screaming about how they need a safe space and need to be protected from ideas, because they'll have a good capacity to deal with these things. When you deny people the chance to learn through suffering, you make them worse for it, not better. And that was part of the flaw of my thinking before this existential crisis I went through. So now, jumping ahead a little bit, in large part because the philosophy that helped me, and it wasn't just reading that one particular novel, there were some other things, that's just the part that sticks in my mind, because I found that philosophy in stories, and I've always loved stories. When I did get out of the military in the spring of 2005, finally, I went and pursued an English degree in college, because where else are you going to learn about awesome stories? And for the first 3 years or so, we learned about literature and different ways to understand it, formulaic criticism and things along those lines, and I absolutely loved it. It was wonderful. All we really did was read a bunch of stories and write essays about them. It was great. However, then in the senior year, when I got into the higher level English studies, there was a particular senior English class I took, I was just flabbergasted at the contradictory and often very stupid nature of what was being done in graduate English studies. So, and this was, almost 10 years ago now, so it's entirely possible that graduate English studies doesn't do this anymore, because apparently things run from one extreme to the next in academic studies all the time. But at the time, what they were really harping on was what's called post-structuralist or postmodern criticism. This comes from people like Paul de Man, Jacques Derrida, and Derrida's idea of deconstruction. So these terms, post-structuralist and postmodern, are very, very big terms that mean a lot of different things to different people in different fields. But at the time, that particular time in English graduate level studies, what it really meant, it was fundamentally centered on a couple of ideas. First is that all of language is little more than a power game designed to either get power or use your power to keep other people oppressed, and that language doesn't communicate successfully. And I'm sure you can immediately see, wait, there's a contradiction there. How can we know that the purpose of this literature is to oppress someone if we don't know what the author is talking about? And there is the contradiction, and that's part of the problem. Paul de Man actually has an essay he wrote where he suggests that language doesn't communicate. And, I was flabbergasted. How can you expect me to take this seriously? You wrote an essay claiming that the communication is impossible. That's ridiculous. It's really, really stupid. But that's what everyone was harping on and on about at that particular time. And I just can't really take it very seriously when someone writes an essay arguing that language doesn't communicate and then expects me to understand what they mean. And so what this did is it pushed me away from English and into philosophy. Before this time, I'd intended to go on and pursue some graduate work in English because I just love good stories. I love thinking about them. I love dissecting them. I love learning about them. But that's not what they were actually doing in graduate level English stuff at that particular time. And the reason it pushed me into philosophy is that it occurred to me that some of these critics would have been well served to just take a few basic level courses in logic, and then maybe they would have come up with some better ideas that aren't so blatantly self-contradictory. So now, later on, I pursued and finished a master's degree in philosophy at Holy Apostles College and Seminary, and the essay that Pat Flint interviewed me about last week, that's based in part on the thesis that I wrote there. Now, the point so far here is that what led me into philosophy wasn't just an academic and intellectual interest, though I do definitely have that. Rather, it was that philosophy was something that actually helped me through a real problem I had in my life. I didn't know how to deal with the reality that was happening to me while I was in the military, and I stumbled across some good philosophy, some good insights in some good books, some good stories, and that enabled me to deal with it and get pulled through. So now imagine my surprise when I found out that most of academic philosophy isn't really very interested in this. In the past 2 years or so, the time when I was writing my thesis at Holy Apostles and the year since then, I've attended 7 professional philosophy conferences, and I've presented my own work at 5 of those. And I've just been absolutely shocked to find out that most of academic philosophy just isn't really interested in using philosophy to actually solve problems. So what I mean by this is that most of the presentations I hear at these philosophy conferences tend to be things like historical criticism of philosophers or highly technical and nuanced points and arguments that have little practical relevance. So go to one of these conferences and it's very likely you'll hear a presentation that starts like this. Most people think Kant or this other philosopher held this view. Well, in my essay here, I argue that he held this slightly different view, which is mostly the same, but slightly different. Or perhaps it might be something like, in the last 50 years or so, philosophers have been discussing this highly technical problem, and we're now at a dead end of it. We don't know what to do about it. So since we're at the dead end in this essay, I'm going to repeat everything everybody else has already said about it. And I'll give you two very practical examples of this here. I was at the central meeting of the APA, the American Philosophical Association, in 2017, and the president of the APA was giving her keynote address. And she was talking about how philosophy seems to be in trouble, we need to make it practical and relevant again, all the kinds of things that I am arguing we need to do. But then she did something odd, where her response to it was, let's take a survey of all the philosophers that we can find and gauge their opinions on diversity. And then in her presentation she turned around and mocked the people who were down on diversity. Now, the trouble is that she never once in that presentation she gave defined what she meant by diversity. Now, diversity is a politically loaded term. It can mean many, many different things. And it was you could kind of infer from the presentation that she probably meant we need people of different races brought into philosophy, but she never explicitly defined that. And I couldn't help but wondering if some of the people whose responses had been negative to diversity were working from a different definition of diversity than she was. And just for example, I'm very, very, very much in favor of diversity of thought and ideas. I think feminist epistemology is nonsense, but I would never say it shouldn't be considered, it shouldn't be presented on. No, present it and we should argue about it and dissect it and try and figure it out. And that's good diversity of thought because you have different viewpoints coming together and competing. Whereas if diversity means, hey, let's get a bunch of people in who look different than us, speak different than us, but think and vote exactly like us, well, then you have a problem. And this was the president of the APA, and she never defined what she meant by diversity. And I was kind of flabbergasted by that because the guy who's essentially the father of philosophy, Socrates, one of his big things was always define your terms, because that makes a big difference. And she didn't do that. Another example that popped up, just earlier this month, was there's a group of 3 people who basically sent out a bunch of nonsense journal articles to be published by journals, and most of them were, well, not most of them, but a significant amount of them were successfully published. I'm quoting from an article in The Atlantic about this here, but over the past 12 months, 3 scholars, James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose, and Peter Boghossian, wrote 20 fake papers using fashionable jargon to argue for ridiculous conclusions and tried to get them placed in high-profile journals in fields including gender studies, queer studies, and fat studies. Their success rate was remarkable. By the time they took their experiment in public, 7 of their articles had been accepted for publication by ostensibly serious peer-reviewed journals. 7 more were still going through various stages of the review process, and only 6 had been rejected. Now, most of these articles that they sent out were quite obviously absolutely ridiculous. One of them dismissed Western astronomy as sexist and imperialist and made a case for physics departments to study feminist astrology and or practice interpretive dance instead. Another one was titled Human Reaction to Rape Culture and Queer Performativity at Urban Dog Parks in Portland, Oregon. Still in another one, they basically just took some of the text of Hitler's Mein Kampf and reworked some of the verbs and nouns a little bit, and it got published. And so the problem I've started to notice here is that it seems like many of these disciplines really just aren't interested in doing actual work, trying to solve actual problems, and the fake articles these people sent out kind of point to that. They demonstrate that to a large degree. The problem is that the reviewers of these journals, and many of these journals, academic journals, are considered highly respectable, were simply unable to tell the difference between nonsense jargon that sounded politically fashionable and real, actual, serious study. And quoting from The Atlantic again, If we are to be serious about remedying discrimination, racism, and sexism, we can't ignore the uncomfortable truth that these hoaxers have revealed. Some academic emperors, the ones who supposedly have the most to say about these critical topics, have no clothes. And that's exactly what I've noticed as I've got a little more into serious academic philosophy. And now, of course, there are some exceptions to this in some disciplines of philosophy, things like philosophy of religion, ethics, philosophy of mind, epistemology, and some other areas. Even while these can get too technical and esoteric at times, there are some good philosophers who are genuinely trying to advance knowledge in these areas. I've read many good books and articles on those subjects. But now the bigger question is, why is this happening? Why is philosophy increasingly becoming abstract, esoteric, and useless to normal people? Now, the reasons are numerous and varied, but the short answer is that for the most part, contemporary philosophy has basically given up on finding answers to the hard questions in life. This is really kind of an oversimplification, but the primary reason is that one of the great philosophical insights of the last couple hundred years has been that it's really, really hard to find good and coherent answers to problems that someone can't deny or argue against. If someone is really clever and smart, they can almost always find a way to deny something that seems obvious to the rest of us. And go to any intro to philosophy college course, and they're going to be talking about that. And as philosophers have figured this inside out, they've come to trust their ability to find answers to these questions less and less. After all, pretty much every philosopher found problems with the answers given by those who came before them. For example, Aristotle threw out Plato's system and came up with his own. And this has always seemed to happen. You can read any history of philosophy book, and you'll see this happening all the time, that the student finds problems with his master's system and comes up with his own. He comes up with his own answers. So after a while, some philosophers just decided we're going to break this cycle by no longer attempting to even find answers. Rather, what they've done is retreat into small niche areas of their disciplines, or they simply criticize the answers everyone else gives. Now, like all things in history and philosophy, this story is a lot bigger and grander, and it's quite a bit more complicated than what I just told you, but I think this is as fair a summary of the problem as I can give you in a short time. So now, after all this long story and data I've given you, why am I doing this podcast? Well, I'm doing it because it seems to me that a large amount of philosophy has lost the very reason why Socrates started doing philosophy in the first place. Namely, that the unexamined life is not worth living, and we need to be living examined lives. We all should be doing everything we can to live examined lives, and that was the main goal of Socrates, and Socrates is sort of kind of the father of philosophy. Again, it's a little more complicated than just calling him the father of philosophy, but it's still a fair thing to do. What philosophers should be doing is looking for ways to solve actual problems again. The late great Dallas Willard said in one lecture I heard him give one time online that what's happened in much of contemporary and modern philosophy now is that it's really just storytelling. They have ideas about the world that don't seem to fit, so they make them fit by telling stories. They'll tell a Kantian story, a Humean story, a Cartesian story, a Freudian story, a Hegelian story, and a phenomenological story, and on it goes. And they're just telling stories rather than actually trying to look at the world and see which of their ideas meet up with it. Now, I think it's fun and can even be very intellectually challenging to do some of the more technical aspects of philosophy, like try and figure out if there's such a thing as a contingent a priori proposition, and the answer is that maybe not. But it's really hard to see how that's going to help anyone through a crisis or actually address any problems in the real world. At the same time I was coming to realize this, probably about a year ago, I watched a discussion online between Camille Pagula and Jordan Peterson. And I said to my wife afterwards, those two people are doing better philosophy than many philosophers at the conferences I've been to, because they're actually trying to address and solve problems that are going on in our society and world. Now, I'm not saying that they're right. Like Camille Pagula and I couldn't be further apart in every way conceivable. I think she's described herself as a transgender atheist feminist. But at the same time, she's actually trying to look at the world and address the problems that are going on and figure out what, if anything, can be done about them. and very few philosophers even make that effort anymore. So, while I cannot promise that I'll never get into high-level philosophy in the show, after all, I'm a philosopher and this is my show, the point here is I want to take what I know about philosophy and use it to help you all live better examined lives. And an examined life is going to give you a much firmer foundation for facing the truth. It'll help you weather things that would otherwise bring you into existential crises. And if you are in an existential crisis, I think it can probably even help you. This is very similar to the parable Christ told about the wise and the foolish builder. The wise man built his house upon the rock, and the foolish builder built it on the sand. And when the rains and storms came, the one on the rock survived. So build your life on the strong foundation of an examined life, and you're going to probably have a much better time of it. Now, I'll also be using philosophy to attempt to address some real-world problems and issues and see what they can do to help us. And since I told my story this week, I'll give you a very short example here. Now, it was election day earlier this week, so let me talk about voting here. Now, many philosophy professors will attempt to freak their students out in the intro to philosophy classes by claiming that there are no good and rational arguments for voting. And, then a bunch of arguments ensue. Now, this is a bit of an overstatement, and it's actually a philosophically bad overstatement, as it's very difficult to prove negative universals like this. For example, some people might claim, there are no black swans. Well, all you have to do to disprove that is point to one black swan. But there is a point here nonetheless, that voting is quite a bit more problematic than most of us like to think about. And here's what I mean. Voting well requires time and commitment. You need to learn about the candidates, the issues, and everything involved. But the level of power your vote actually has makes it unlikely you're going to see a return on the investment of the time you spent in it. The time I spend learning about ballot issues and candidates and various things along those lines, well, I could spend that enjoying myself, playing games, studying philosophy, enjoying other hobbies, bettering myself as a person, spending time with my family, and so on and so forth. Now, uneducated voting is definitely a bad thing, so despite the fact that many people do it, that's not a good option. We don't want to have you voting without being educated on it. Also, most people vote because they want to change the outcome of the election. That's how politicians stump for votes. They're going to try and convince you that if you don't vote for them, the other side will get in and ruin things, or that if they get in, they'll do good things for you. But now the trouble here is that the odds of your vote actually having a substantive effect are very, very low. Here's a quote from an article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on this. There is some debate among economists and political scientists over the precise way to calculate the probability that a vote will be decisive. Nevertheless, they generally agree that the probability that the model individual voter in a typical election will break a tie is small. So small that the expected benefit of the model vote for a good candidate is far less than a millionth of a penny. The most optimistic estimate in the literature claims that in a presidential election, an American voter could have as high as a chance of 1 in 10 million of breaking the tie, but only if that voter lives in one of the 3 or 4 swing states, and thus only if she votes for a major party candidate. Thus, on both these popular models, for most votes in most elections, voting for the purpose of trying to change the outcome is irrational. The expected costs exceed the expected benefits by many orders of magnitude. End quote. Now, the irony here is that small local elections, the odds of your vote having a substantive effect go quite dramatically. There it might be as high as 1 in 100 or 1 in 500. But no one really gets excited about those small local elections. We only get excited about the ones where your vote has a 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 million chance of making a difference. Now, in response to this fact that your vote generally doesn't really have very much power or is pretty unlikely to affect the outcome, what many people will turn around and argue is that we have a civic or moral duty or obligation to vote. However, the trouble with this is that moral duties and obligations typically require us to have the ability to make a difference. Just for example, let's say I'm walking along the beach and I see someone drowning. Now, I probably do have an obligation to try to do something to help save that person. Jump in the water, try and drag them out, call someone, or do something. But I don't have that obligation if there's literally nothing I can do. Suppose I don't have any legs and I'm in a wheelchair, there's no cell service, and there's literally no possible way that I can do anything to save that person who's drowning. Well, then it'd be very hard to say that I have an obligation to save them when it's impossible for me to do so. And as I just talked about, it's nearly impossible that my vote will have a substantive difference in any election. So how can I have a moral or civic duty to do something that will almost certainly, at better than 99.9%, make no difference at all? Now, I know many of us hate it when people talk about politics on social media and things like that, and for good reason. But as unpleasant as it is to say, you probably have a better chance of affecting the outcome of most elections simply by talking to two or three people about it than you do by voting. So now you're probably wondering, well, what's the solution to this problem? What then shall we do? And I think the answer, the solution here is, think back to the drowning person example again. We probably would agree, most everyone would, that I don't have a moral obligation to try and save the drowning person if I know it's impossible for me to do that. If there's literally nothing I can do, I haven't done anything morally wrong by not attempting. But now, what if there's a small possibility I could do something, but it's unlikely? Say I can swim, but I'm just a very, very bad swimmer. Or say there's cell reception in the area, but it's very poor cell reception. Well, do I have an obligation to still try even though I'm a bad swimmer? Do I have an obligation to still try and make the phone call even though it's unlikely to go through? Well, like in the case of being a poor swimmer, maybe, maybe not. I think there probably is an obligation on me to at least try and make the phone call, even if it's unlikely to work. And there's certainly no consensus among people who study these types of issues on this question, whether or not, if it's unlikely that you can have a substantive effect, whether you still have an obligation to do so. But what we can say is that if I try despite the fact that I might fail, if I try even in the face of 1,000 to 1 odds or 10,000 to 1 odds, then I did something virtuous and courageous. Perhaps I'm not under an obligation to try in this case where there's only a 1 in 10,000 chance I might save that person. But if I try anyway, I did something very good, and we all generally agree on that. Now, also tie this into the fact that life is often complex and difficult, and we're often very poor at judging the odds of what something actually is occurring. Since we're talking about voting, look at how elections turn out to see that. Everybody who's on TV thinks they know how it's going to turn out, and how often are they wrong? Well, it happens, and that's because despite our best efforts, we often aren't good at judging the odds of things. So it could be that while it seems to me I've only got a 1 in 10,000 chance of saving the drowning man, it might actually be, say, 1 in 10. So isn't it good and virtuous of me to just try, even if I think the odds of it making a difference are so low? Now, I say it's likewise with voting. I think we can argue that, rationally, we probably don't have a civic or moral duty to vote because it's so unlikely it's going to make a difference. It's a virtuous thing to sacrifice the time and energy and effort necessary to learn about the candidates and issues and vote well, even if it's unlikely our vote will have a substantive effect. There's something good and virtuous about doing that. And that's how I solve that problem. Now, a practical effect of this is that we should all be a lot more humble when we're talking about voting. So one of my friends voted for Trump and one voted for Clinton. Neither of their votes caused anything to happen. It's just the way it is. If both of them had refused to vote, things would have been exactly the same. So why should I get so angry at them over whether or not they voted for a particular person or candidate? Now, like all things, it can get a little more complicated than that, but I think that's the main point to draw away from this is your vote really, really doesn't have very much power. It's probably still a good and virtuous thing for you to go vote, to vote well, learn about it, the candidates and the issues involved. But if your guy wins, it wasn't because of you. And if your guy loses, it wasn't because of you. And it wasn't because of your friend who voted the other way. So calm down and don't freak out at them for that. Now, I'd like to do something at the end of each thing where I talk about a philosophical good and a philosophical ill that I was aware of that happened in the last week. And so the philosophical good that's happened in this last week is that we just had an election and there's a peaceful transition of power in the states. That's a very, very wonderful thing. If you look historically, it's extremely rare. It almost never happens. And the U.S. has been pulling it off for almost 250 years now. That's an exceptional thing that we should all be very, very grateful for. And we often aren't as grateful for it as we should be. A philosophical bad is how we go around encouraging everybody to vote. And you're probably thinking, what? Didn't he just say it's a virtuous thing to vote? Well, yes, it is, but only if you vote as a well-informed voter, only if you've thought it out, if you've done the research. People voting who have no idea what's going on should not be voting. And the fact of the matter is, if you have to be encouraged or told to vote, it's very unlikely you've done the research necessary to be a good voter, so you probably shouldn't be voting. Almost every election cycle, you hear somebody do a campaign about getting out the vote, but they never bother to say, hey, go learn about who you should vote for. Instead, they just say, go and vote. And that's pretty dumb. And if you're not going to take the time to learn about the candidates and issues, then please do everyone else a favor and don't vote, because you're not going to be a good voter. Lastly here, I'll do a book recommendation. There's a wonderful novel, which is a very short little one called The Giver, and it makes pretty much the same point I was making earlier about how it's through suffering that we're made better people, and if you protect everyone and everything from suffering, it really has pretty horrific consequences. They made a movie about it that's actually pretty good too, so watch the movie and read the book. And well, that's all I've got for this week, so send me a message, let me know what you thought, give me some feedback, I'd be happy to hear it. Send me feedback on topics that you think that need a philosophical treatment, that you think there are issues that we could attempt to address or solve. So thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you all again next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.